That's exactly what happened next in front of 9 board members and one silent janitor standing by the door. $3 million in frozen assets. 4 shell accounts seized. One signature that sealed his fate. Let me take you back 2 weeks to the morning none of them saw this coming, because what started with a kicked mop bucket ended in a boardroom no one will forget. On Friday afternoon, William Hayes called an emergency board meeting. His voice, usually calm, carried a weight no one in that room had heard before. Richard Coleman walked in, still smiling. Vice President, custom suit, zero idea what was coming. Clause 14, paragraph 2, William said. He slid a single document across the table. Effective immediately, you're terminated. Richard's smile disappeared. His hands gripped the table edge. Have you ever watched a powerful man realize in real time that the ground beneath him was already gone?
Predator or prey? One wrong move, a fatal mistake. The trap in the dark just snapped shut.
The marble lobby of Sterling Tech held its breath. Dawn had not yet broken over the glass towers outside. David Foster knelt at the base of the reception desk. He ran his cloth in slow circles across veined white stone. 3 hours he had given this floor already. 3 hours of silence. 3 hours of breath. 3 hours of nothing but the squeak of rubber soles. Nothing but the hiss of water against marble. His uniform hung loose on his frame, faded gray sleeves rolled twice at the wrist. His boots were older than the job itself, cracked at the toe, soles worn thin from years of standing. Not once, not even briefly, did he look up when the elevator chimed. Richard Coleman stepped out first. Phone pressed to his ear, he laughed at something only he found funny. His Rolex caught the crystal chandelier light. It threw the light back in a hard, cold flash. Behind him trailed 2 junior executives. Behind them, clutching a stack of files against her chest, walked Victoria Sterling. "Get this out of my way." Richard did not slow his stride. He did not look down. His foot connected with the mop bucket in one clean, contemptuous, practiced arc. Dirty water sprayed across the floor. It soaked into David's boots, dark and cold. It spread up past his ankles. Victoria froze near the elevator doors. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. David did not flinch. He did not speak. He looked up at Richard with an expression so calm it seemed rehearsed. Richard's laughter caught somewhere in his throat. "I asked you a question." Richard's voice rose now, sharp and performative. He aimed it at the small crowd gathering near the desk. "Are you deaf or just stupid?" Silent, steady, and unmoved. David lowered himself to his knees. He gathered the cloth. He began wiping the spreading water. Not a word, not a glance toward the men, now watching him with quiet amusement. Victoria's hands tightened around her files. Her eyes, wide and glassy, tracked every motion. She wanted to speak. She did not. "Look at him." Richard turned to his companions. He spread his arms wide as if presenting a specimen. "This is what happens when people refuse to better themselves. This is the standard he chose for his own life." There it was. Standard. He said it like a gift, like a verdict, a word that belonged only to men who wore $10,000 watches. David's jaw did not move. His hands kept working, methodical, precise. He folded the cloth over itself. He wrung it out again. Under his breath, low enough that only the marble could hear it, he recited something. Numbers, clauses, fragments of legal language that had no place in a man wearing a stained uniform. Section 14. Liability threshold. Willful conduct exceeding negligence. Victoria heard none of it. Richard heard none of it. The words dissolved into the wet slap of cloth against stone. "Since you love this floor so much." Richard crouched, slightly mockery dripping from every syllable. "You can do the boardroom the same way. On your knees." All the way there, the lobby went still. Even the junior executives shifted uncomfortable now. Their eyes flicked toward the elevator, toward the exit, anywhere but David's face. David rose. He gathered his bucket. He did not argue. He did not ask why. He simply turned toward the long marble corridor leading to the executive floor. He lowered himself down again, knee against stone, cloth against stone, moving forward one slow length at a time. Victoria pressed a hand to her mouth. She watched him crawl the length of the hallway. She watched the water darken his trousers. She watched Richard follow behind phone rays filming. He was narrating for an audience that did not exist yet. David's knees ached against the cold floor. His shoulders stayed level. His breathing stayed even. Somewhere behind that stillness, a different kind of work was happening. Behind the humiliation soaking into denim, a quiet ledger was filling itself in. Numbers, dates, clause after clause filed away, sealed, waiting. By the time he reached the boardroom doors, his palms had gone raw. His trousers clung wet and cold against his skin. He did not stop to look at either. He pressed the cloth flat against the threshold. He began again section by section. The same slow circles, the same steady rhythm he had used on the lobby floor. By then Richard had reached the door frame, watching filming, savoring the moment. "Perfect, babe," he said. "This is exactly where you belong." David said nothing. Silent, steady, patient. He wrung the cloth and moved to the next tile. Near the elevator, still frozen, Victoria lowered her files an inch. Her knuckles had gone white around the edges of the folder. She looked away. Then slowly she forced herself to look back. Watching was the only decency left to offer him. Richard would forget all of this by lunch. To him, this was Tuesday. This was ownership. This was a lesson delivered to a man who did not matter enough to remember. He had no idea what he had just handed over. Not a broken man, not a beaten one. Just a witness with a memory built like a vault, a debt quiet and patient. It accrued interest with every second he stayed on his knees. The elevator doors closed behind Richard's laughter. The lobby fell silent again. Only the drip of water remained ticking against marble. It counted down towards something Richard Coleman could not yet see. Night settled over Sterling Tech like a second skin. The lobby lights dimmed to half power at 9. By 11, David Foster pushed his cart alone. The corridors belonged for these few hours only to him. The executive floor smelled different at night. Cologne and cigar smoke lingered in the air, layered over leather and old money. David moved past darkened offices. He emptied bins one by one, methodical, unhurried, silent. Richard Coleman's office door stood open. David wheeled his cart inside. The trash can beside the desk overflowed. Paper spilled across the carpet and torn strips shredded scattered careless. David crouched to gather it. His hand paused over one fragment. A column of numbers. A partial signature. The edge of a wire transfer routing code. He did not move for a long moment. Then he gathered every scrap, careful now, deliberate. He folded them into a plastic liner tucked inside his cart. By midnight, the floor was clear. David wheeled his cart toward the service elevator. The liner stayed hidden beneath rolls of trash bags. Nobody stopped him. Nobody looked twice at a janitor pushing a cart. The storage room in the basement was small, windowless, lit by a single flickering bulb. David locked the door behind him. He spread a folding table across the narrow space. He emptied the liner onto its surface. Hundreds of fragments. Torn edges, jagged corners. Ink bleeding where the shredder blades had caught the paper at an angle. He sat down. He began. One piece at a time he turned fragments over, searching for edges that matched. A torn corner here, a ragged line there. He worked with the patience of a sniper, a man who understood that impatience destroyed evidence. Hours passed. His back ached against the metal folding chair. His eyes burned under the single bulb. He did not stop. By 3 a.m, 3 sheets had taken shape, taped together fragment by fragment, edge by edge. Whole paragraphs emerged from the wreckage. He read the first sheet twice. A shell company, a routing number, an offshore account registered in the Caymans. He read the second sheet. Transfer authorization signed and dated. Funds moved from Sterling Tech's client trust account. A private holding structure waiting on the other end. $3 million moved in small increments, spread across 11 months, quiet enough to avoid every automatic flag. He read the third sheet last. Richard Coleman's initials sat at the bottom corner. Not typed, not stamped, handwritten in blue ink, beside a dollar figure that made the fluorescent bulb overhead seem to hum louder. David set the sheet down. He did not speak. He did not smile. His hands, steady through 3 hours of taping and matching, went still now. They rested flat against the folding table. This was not petty theft. This was not a rounding error. This was federal wire fraud. This was embezzlement. This was falsification of corporate trust records stacked into a wall built to bury someone. He thought of the marble floor. He thought of knees pressed against cold stone. He thought of dirty water soaking through denim. He thought of a word tossed at him like a verdict. Standard. He almost laughed. He did not. Instead, he gathered the 3 taped sheets. He added every unmatched fragment. He slid them into a manila folder. He wrapped the folder in a plastic bag, sealed it. He knelt beside his backpack in the corner of the room. The backpack was old canvas gone gray with wear straps frayed at the edges. He unzipped the bottom compartment, the one he never used for anything else. He slid the folder deep inside, beneath a false liner sewn there years earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with paperwork. He zipped it shut. He sat back against the cold concrete wall. The janitor who had knelt on marble that morning was gone now, silent while a man in a Rolex mocked him in front of witnesses. That man no longer existed. In his place sat someone else entirely, someone who understood exactly what these fragments meant. Someone who had studied federal fraud statutes long before he ever picked up a mop. He did not know yet how he would use what he now held. He knew only this. Richard Coleman had, without meaning, to thrown away the one thing that could end him. Paper does not lie. Ink does not forget. Somewhere above him, 11 floors up, a man slept soundly. A penthouse built on numbers he thought no one would ever see again. David turned off the single bulb. He sat a moment longer in the dark. He listened to the building settle around him, steel and concrete ticking as it cooled. Then he rose. He lifted his cart. He returned to the quiet, ordinary work of emptying bins, as if nothing in the world had changed. But something had. The scraps in his backpack were no longer garbage. They were a fuse, coiled and waiting. Somewhere down the line, someone was going to strike the match. They would never know they held it. The boardroom smelled of leather and money by the time David Foster arrived. He wheeled his cart through the double doors at 9 sharp. Richard Coleman stood at the head of the table already. Laptop open, slides glowing on the wall screen behind him. William Hayes sat at the far end. 63 years old, silver-haired. His bespoke charcoal suit fit him like a second layer of skin. He tapped a gold pen against a legal pad. His eyes stayed fixed on the numbers, not the men presenting them. Perfect timing. Richard did not look up from his laptop. Foster, tidy up around the edges. Try not to breathe too loud. David said nothing. He moved to the far corner of the room. He began wiping the credenza, slow, careful, invisible. Richard turned back to Hayes, all polished now, all rehearsed charm. As you can see, sir, our projected growth curve for the Northeast Division sits at 31%. He paused. Conservative by industry standards. Hayes did not respond. He clicked his pen once. This is the kind of number that gets noticed at the board level. Richard gestured toward the screen, palm open, as if presenting a gift. Standard practice, of course. Exceptional execution. Standard. There was that word again. David kept his cloth moving in slow circles across the credenza. His eyes, sharp, patient, and unreadable, tracked the screen behind Richard's shoulder. Numbers, columns, a quarterly revenue table dressed up in confident blue and green. Something in the third column did not sit right. He did not stop cleaning. His hand kept its rhythm steady, unbroken. His mind ran the math a second time. Then a third. The growth curve assumed a client renewal rate. That rate did not match the actual contracts on file. He knew those contracts well. He had emptied enough shredded paper from this floor. He knew which accounts had already walked. Richard was inflating a number that did not exist. Foster. Richard snapped his fingers without turning around. The stain by the window. Now would be lovely. David crossed the room. He knelt beside the window, cloth in hand. He began scrubbing at a mark on the baseboard. Richard resumed his pitch to Hayes, voice smooth and confident, untouched by the man kneeling 6 feet away. With respect, sir, this kind of vision requires someone who understands scale. Richard's smile widened. Not everyone in this building operates at that level. Some people mop floors. Others build empires. Hayes said nothing. His eyes flicked briefly toward David, then back to the screen. David's jaw stayed loose. His shoulders stayed level. Inside, a different process ran entirely. Slide 4, slide 5, slide 6. Each one built on the last. Each lie stacked carefully on top of the one before it. A tower of numbers waiting to collapse the moment anyone checked the underlying contracts. He memorized the timestamp in the corner of the presentation. 9:17. He memorized the slide count. 14 total. He memorized the exact phrase Richard used for the fabricated renewal rate. Word for word, syllable for syllable. Later that night, alone in the storage room, he would write it down. A notebook gone yellow with age. Pages filled with a decade of careful, patient documentation. Nobody at Sterling Tech had ever thought to question it. Any questions, sir? Richard closed his laptop with a satisfied click. Hayes set down his pen. None. Proceed. Richard's smile stretched wider. He glanced once toward David, still kneeling by the window, still silent, still invisible in every way that mattered to a man like Richard Coleman. See, Richard said almost to himself, some people know their place. David rose. He gathered his cart. He walked toward the door without a word, without a glance back. His face stayed as calm as the marble he had polished a lifetime ago that same week. Behind him, William Hayes returned to his legal pad. Richard poured himself a glass of water. He was already rehearsing the next lie for the next room down the hall. Neither man noticed. Neither man understood. The janitor walking out of that boardroom carried 14 slides of fabricated numbers. He carried them inside a memory sharper than any recorder in the building. Every billionaire laughing at the head of that table believed they stood on solid ground. They were mistaken, not careless, not unlucky, simply blind. Beneath their polished shoes, a blade was already being sharpened. Slow, patient, silent, one number at a time. By the time the elevator doors closed, David had filed the entire presentation away. He filed it in the same quiet place, the place where he kept everything Richard Coleman had ever thrown at him. Every insult, every command, every careless lie told in front of an audience too comfortable to check the math. None of it would be forgotten. None of it would go to waste. No one saw this level of corruption coming. A vile man in power, ready to slander, an innocent person just to feed his sick ego. If it were me, I would have smashed that arrogant face in, right then and there. Imagine having to swallow your rage, staying silent while your enemy tries to take away your livelihood, but keep your eyes open. The darkness is about to swallow their light whole. The print room on the 4th floor stayed locked after 7 o'clock. But David had learned months ago that the maintenance override code worked on every door in this building, including the ones marked authorized personnel only. He slipped inside at 9:30. The corridor behind him empty, the fluorescent lights overhead, humming in a fixture nobody had bothered to replace since the merger. The printer sat against the far wall, its cabinet locked, but the drawer beneath it, the one storing master copies of internal policy, was not. He knelt and pulled it open. Rows of binders lined the shelf, each labeled in faded type. Employee conduct, severance protocols, asset recovery and termination. He drew out the last one, its spine cracked from years of use, and laid it flat on the copier glass. The machine whirred to life. Page after page slid through, and David watched each one with the same stillness he brought to every task in this building. Patient, unremarkable, invisible. His mind, though, moved faster than his hands. He was already cross-referencing clauses against the fraud figures memorized weeks earlier, already building the legal scaffolding that would eventually collapse around Richard Coleman's neck. A key turned in the door. David froze for half a second, no more, before his hands found the printer's paper tray and began working it loose, exactly the posture of a man fixing a jam. Victoria Sterling stepped inside a stack of onboarding folders in her arms and stopped short at the sight of him. David. Her voice carried more surprise than suspicion. "What are you doing in here?" "Paper jam, Miss Sterling." He did not look up. "Printer's been sticking all week. Thought I'd clear it before the morning shift." She glanced past him at the copier, its screen still glowing a stack of freshly printed pages sitting in the output tray. Her eyes moved to the binder open on the glass, its title clearly visible even from across the room. Something flickered across her face. Not confusion, recognition maybe of a question she had no intention of asking out loud. "That's the severance policy," she said quietly. "Is it?" David straightened unhurried and closed the drawer with his knee. "Didn't notice." Victoria did not move for a long moment. She looked at him, really looked the way she had not allowed herself to look at anyone in this building for a long time. His hands were steady. His eyes were sharp-focused, entirely unlike the practiced blankness he wore during the day. This was not a man fixing a jam. This was a man building something, and she understood in the space of 3 seconds that whatever it was not for her to interrupt. "I should get back to the front desk," she said. "Have a good evening, Miss Sterling." She left without another word, the door clicking shut behind her, and David listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor before he allowed himself to breathe again. He returned to the copier. Page by page, he finished what he had started, the machine's low hum the only sound in the empty room. When it was done, he gathered the printed sheets into a neat stack and returned the original binder to its drawer exactly as he had found it, exactly as if no one had ever touched it. Then he sat at the small table by the window, the copied pages spread before him under a single desk lamp, and began to read. Section 14. Asset recovery and termination for cause. His eyes moved down the page, slow and deliberate, until they stopped on a single subsection. 14.2. He read it once, then again. Under 14.2, any employee found to have engaged in financial misconduct forfeited not only employment, but all unvested equity, all deferred compensation, and in cases involving fraud exceeding a specified threshold, became subject to full asset seizure pending federal investigation. Richard Coleman had signed this policy himself 3 years earlier as part of a compliance overhaul meant to protect the company's image after a smaller scandal involving a different executive. He had built the trap without knowing his own name would one day fill it. David pulled a red pen from his shirt pocket and drew a single line beneath the clause, careful, precise, the ink bleeding faintly through to the page beneath. He circled the threshold figure twice. $3 million. The exact amount buried in the shredded document still hidden in his storage closet locker. The pieces fit now cleanly, completely, each one locking into the next, like a mechanism built to run only once. He folded the copied pages into thirds and tucked them inside his jacket close against his chest, the way a soldier might carry a weapon already loaded, already aimed, waiting only for the right moment to fire. Outside the window, the city lights blurred against the glass, indifferent to the quiet war being assembled one floor above the marble lobby where a man had once been forced to crawl on his knees. David switched off the desk lamp. He would not need to raise his voice. He would not need to break a single rule. Richard Coleman's own signature, his own carefully worded policy, would be the instrument of his undoing, and David Foster intended to be standing close enough to watch when it finally closed around him. The morning began with a single sheet of paper missing. Richard Coleman stood over his desk and his hands shook. He counted the folders twice. The financial summary was gone. Not filed, not misplaced. Gone. Sweat gathered at his collar. His Rolex caught the light, but for once he did not glance at it. He looked past his office, past the glass wall, into the lobby where a familiar shape moved a cart of trash bins toward the loading dock. David Foster. Richard's mouth twisted. The thought arrived fast, ugly, and convenient. He did not check the printer tray. He did not check his briefcase. He marched into the lobby and his voice cracked the air like a whip. "Someone in this building is stealing from me." Heads turned. Conversations stopped. David kept walking, unhurried, his cartwheels squeaking against the marble. "Yee," Richard pointed. His finger trembled. "Stop right there." David stopped. "Empty your pockets," Richard said. "Now." David turned. His face showed nothing. Not fear, not surprise, just the same flat calm he wore every day, the calm of a man who had already survived worse than this. "Sir, I have not taken anything," David said. His voice stayed low, even respectful. "May I ask what's missing?" "Don't play stupid with me." Richard's jaw clenched. "Office supplies, pens, paper, files. Things go missing every week around here, and I've had enough." It was a lie built on nothing, and everyone in the lobby knew it. Nobody said a word. Richard snapped his fingers toward the security desk. "Get Park down here, now!" Dennis Park arrived within minutes. Tactical vest radio clipped to his shoulder boots, heavy on the stone floor. He looked at Richard, then at David, then back at Richard. "Search him," Richard said. "Publicly. I want everyone to see what happens when you steal from this company." Dennis hesitated for half a second. Then he stepped forward. David set down his cart. He raised both arms, slow and deliberate palms, open wrists loose. No resistance, no protest, just stillness. Dennis patted down his uniform, his pockets, the hem of his sleeves. Nothing. "Nothing here," Dennis said. "Check the bag." Richard's voice rose again, sharper, now thinner. "The backpack. I want it emptied on the floor." A small crowd had gathered by then. Employees near the elevators, a receptionist frozen mid-sentence, phones lowered but watching. David felt every eye on him, and he did not flinch. His backpack sat on the cart 3 feet from the trash bins he had been pushing toward the loading dock. Inside that bag were weeks of reconstructed evidence, $3 million of buried fraud taped together one fragment at a time. In a storage closet nobody checked. If Dennis opened it here in front of Richard, everything ended before it began. David did not reach for the bag. Instead, he stepped sideways toward the cart and lifted the lid of the largest trash bin. "This is what I was moving, sir," he said. "Recycling from the executive floor. Paper, mostly. I can show you." Richard's eyes flicked toward the bin. Something in him, some old instinct for control, could not resist watching his own trash being handled by another man. He stepped closer, peered inside, saw nothing but shredded paper and crushed cans. "That's not..." Richard started. He stopped. His hand went to his temple. "That's not what I meant." "You said things were missing, sir." David's tone did not change. "I wanted to help you look." Dennis glanced at the backpack, then at Richard, waiting for an order that did not come. Richard stared at the trash bin a moment longer, and his certainty so loud 30 seconds earlier began to curdle into something smaller. "Fine." Richard's voice dropped uneven now. "Fine. Just get back to work. All of you." The crowd dispersed slowly, quietly, the way people move when they have seen something they will discuss later behind closed doors. Dennis Park lingered a moment studying David's face for a flicker of relief that never came before walking away. David lowered his arms. He picked up his backpack and he did not open it. He set it back on the cart beneath a folded tarp beside the bins he had emptied 100 times before without anyone noticing what he carried. Richard stood alone near his office door, breathing hard, his certainty gone, but his suspicion not. He would not forget this. He would not let it go. And that more than anything was the problem. That evening in the storage closet, David slid the backpack into the bottom drawer of a locked toolbox. He turned the key twice. Somewhere above him, Richard Coleman was still pacing his office, convinced a thief was circling him, never once suspecting that the man he had just humiliated in front of 40 witnesses was the one holding the leash. 6 weeks of silence ended on a Friday evening when David walked toward the staff lockers to collect his things. His shift was over. His shoulders ached. The backpack waited inside, packed with nothing more suspicious than a water bottle and a folded jacket, the real evidence long since moved to the storage closet. He reached for the locker door. A hand slammed it shut. Going somewhere. Richard Coleman stood behind him too close, his breath sour with scotch from an early celebration lunch. His tie hung loose. His eyes were wrong, glassy, unsteady. Just heading home, sir. David kept his voice flat. Home. Richard laughed short and ugly. You don't get to go home yet. He grabbed David's shoulder and shoved. David hit the floor hard, his knee cracking against the marble, his palm scraping raw. Around them, a dozen employees stopped walking. Nobody moved to help. Victoria Sterling froze near the elevator bank, a folder pressed to her chest. Her eyes went wide, then wet. She pressed a hand over her mouth. Richard yanked the locker door open and tore out the backpack. He turned it upside down and shook it. A water bottle clattered across the floor. The jacket fell in a heap. A cracked phone case skidded to a stop near the wall. This is it. Richard's voice cracked, half fury, half something closer to panic. This is all you've got. David said nothing. He knelt on the cold stone, watching his few possessions scatter, and he did not reach for them. You think I don't see you? Richard's words came faster now, jagged, missing pieces. Watching me, always watching, like you know something, like you're better than... He stopped, started again. This whole place would fall apart without people like me, not people like you. He kicked the water bottle across the lobby. It rolled under a bench and stopped. Effective today, Richard said. You're done. No job, no paycheck, nothing. Victoria's breath caught audibly. Richard, you can't just... I can do whatever I want. He did not look at her. This is my building. David rose slowly, his knee throbbing his palm, bleeding a thin line into his sleeve. He gathered the jacket first, then the phone case, then the water bottle retrieved from beneath the bench without a word of protest. Richard watched him do it, and something in his face wanted David to break, to shout, to cry, to beg. David did none of it. He straightened the backpack empty in his hand and looked at Richard with the same flat calm he always wore. That calm, more than any scream, could have seemed to enrage Richard further. Nothing to say. Richard stepped closer. Not even a word. Gone. The job. Gone. The paycheck. Gone. Every safety net he had built quiet and careful over years of scraping by. Gone. David thought of his rent, his mother's medication, the thin stack of bills in his apartment drawer, already too thin. He thought of all of it in the space of 2 seconds, and none of it showed on his face. Richard turned on his heel, already laughing with someone near the elevator, already forgetting the man he had just destroyed. The sound of his laughter echoed off the marble, bright and careless. The laugh of a man who believed consequences were things that happened to other people. Victoria approached once Richard was gone, her hands shaking as she helped gather the last of David's things. David, I am so sorry. I should have said something. I should have... It's not your fault, Miss Sterling. His voice was quiet. What are you going to do? David looked down at the cracked phone case in his hand, at the small dent along its edge, worn smooth from years of use. It had belonged to his mother once before she passed, a small, stubborn thing that refused to die no matter how many times it was dropped, cracked, patched back together. He closed his fingers around it. I'm going to finish something, he said. Victoria did not understand what he meant. Nobody watching would have understood. To them, he was simply a man who had lost his job kneeling in the wreckage of his own belongings alone in a marble lobby built to remind people like him exactly where they stood. But David Foster had spent 6 weeks piecing together evidence in the dark. He had memorized fraud figures whispered under his breath while scrubbing floors. He had watched, waited, and said nothing, not because he was weak, but because the moment was not yet his. Now it was. He slid the cracked phone case into his pocket next to his heart and walked out of Sterling Tech into the gathering dusk. Behind him, the marble floor gleamed under crystal light, spotless, polished, cold. No trace remained that a man had knelt there, humiliated, stripped of everything but the one thing Richard Coleman could never take from him: the truth. Dennis Park arrived within the hour, radio crackling at his shoulder, his face set in the neutral expression of a man paid not to ask questions. "Mr. Foster." His voice was flat. "I need to escort you off the property." David stood by the loading dock, his small pile of belongings gathered into a cardboard box. Someone from HR had left without a word. He nodded once. 2 minutes, David said. "I have orders to move you along now." 2 minutes. David's eyes met his steady, unblinking. "I am not a criminal officer, Park. I would like to leave with what dignity is left to me." Something shifted in Dennis's face. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition maybe of a man who refused to be rushed into shame. He stepped back and folded his arms. 2 minutes, Dennis said. David turned toward the storage closet at the end of the corridor, the one place in this building nobody else bothered to check twice. Cleaning supplies, broken chairs, a locked toolbox in the corner. Dust settled thick along its lid. Inside, he knelt and opened it. The backpack sat untouched exactly where he had left it weeks earlier. He pulled it free, his fingers steady despite the tremor building somewhere beneath his ribs. Paper first. Reconstructed, taped, sorted by date and account number, 3 months of patient work, condensed into a single folder. He wrapped it in a plastic bag and pressed it flat against his chest beneath his jacket. Then the phone. A prepaid burner purchased weeks ago with cash from a corner store 2 towns over, untraceable, unregistered, waiting for exactly this moment. David powered it on. The screen glowed faint blue in the dim closet. His hands did not shake as he typed. He attached the scanned documents one by one, each file named with the same clinical precision he had used to memorize legal codes while scrubbing floors. Embezzlement figures, offshore transfers, falsified projections, every fragment of the puzzle he had spent weeks assembling in silence. The subject line read simply, "Corporate Fraud Sterling Tech Documentation Attached." He addressed it to the SEC's anonymous tip line, encrypted, routed through 3 relays he had researched in a public library during his lunch breaks. His thumb hovered over the send button. Somewhere above him, Richard Coleman was likely celebrating, already toasting his own cleverness with expensive scotch, utterly unaware that the ground beneath his polished shoes had just begun to crack. David pressed send. The message vanished into the current of the internet, untraceable, unstoppable, already beginning its slow crawl through federal servers toward the desk of an investigator he had never met. There was no dramatic flash, no sound, just a small progress bar, and then nothing. He crushed the phone under his heel 3 times until the screen shattered and the circuitry inside went dark. He wrapped the pieces in a rag and buried them at the bottom of a trash bag destined for the compactor. No trace, no evidence but the one already sent. He tucked the folder of documents deeper into his jacket, close against his ribs, and walked back down the corridor. Dennis was waiting exactly where he had left him, arms still crossed, watching the door. "Time's up," Dennis said. "Understood." David lifted his cardboard box. Dennis fell into step beside him, close but not rough, escorting rather than dragging. As they passed the security desk, David reached into his jacket, not for the hidden folder, but for something else. A worn copy of the company handbook, its pages dog-eared, one section marked in red ink so heavy it had bled through to the next page. He held it loosely at his side. Not a threat. Not yet. Just a quiet reminder to himself of exactly which clause would matter most in the days to come. Dennis glanced at the book, but said nothing. They reached the lobby doors. Evening traffic hummed beyond the glass headlights sliding across wet pavement, the city indifferent to the war that had just begun inside these marble walls. "For what it's worth," Dennis said low enough that no one else could hear, "none of us liked how he treated you." David paused at the threshold. "Then you'll understand soon enough why it stops." He stepped outside into the cold. Behind him the doors swung shut, sealing away the gleaming lobby, the crystal chandeliers the Empire built on, borrowed time. Somewhere in a federal building across the city, a server had already logged the timestamp of an anonymous submission. A case number would be assigned within hours. Analysts would begin cross-referencing account numbers before sunrise. The countdown had started, and Richard Coleman did not even know the clock was running. The security escort should have ended at the front doors. Instead, David Foster stopped 3 feet from the exit and turned back toward the executive corridor. Dennis Park frowned. "Mr. Foster, the exit is that way." "I know." David's voice stayed level. "I need 2 more minutes." He did not wait for permission. He walked past the reception desk, past a receptionist who half rose from her chair, past the security checkpoint Dennis had just cleared him through. His steps were unhurried, deliberate, the same measured pace he had used for months while pushing a cart through this same building. Behind the double oak doors of the executive boardroom, laughter rose in easy waves. Richard Coleman stood at the head of the long table, a champagne glass, raised his Rolex catching the overhead light. William Hayes sat beside him, silver-haired, unreadable, sipping something amber from a heavy crystal tumbler. David pushed the doors open. The laughter died. "What is this?" Richard's face twisted disbelief, curdling fast into fury. "I had you thrown out. Get him out of here. Now!" Dennis appeared in the doorway behind David, but he did not move to grab him. He simply stood watching. "Get security back in here." Richard's voice climbed thin and sharp. "This filth doesn't belong in this room." David walked to the table anyway. He set down a thick folder, its edges worn from weeks of careful handling, its contents organized by date, account, and signature. The sound of it landing on polished mahogany silenced whatever else Richard had been about to shout. "Mr. Hayes," David said, his voice quiet but perfectly clear. "I believe you'll want to review this before your celebration continues." William Hayes did not move at first. His eyes flicked from David's calm face to the folder, then to Richard, whose champagne glass now trembled slightly in his grip. "Section 4, David continued, outlines a series of wire transfers routed through 3 shell accounts in the Caymans, each one authorized under Richard Coleman's signature. Section 7 cross-references those transfers against falsified quarterly projections presented to this board 11 weeks ago. "This is fabricated." Richard's voice cracked down the middle. "He's lying. He's a janitor, for God's sake. He wouldn't know a balance sheet from a napkin." "I would ask you to check the signatures yourself, sir." David did not raise his voice. "They match your own hand." William Hayes opened the folder. Silence spread through the room like smoke. Pages turned one after another, the only sound the soft rustle of paper and the faint hum of the building's ventilation. Hayes's expression did not change, not visibly, but his jaw tightened with each page he read. Victoria Sterling stood frozen near the window, a stack of catering menus forgotten in her arms. Her eyes moved from David to Richard and back again, wide with something that had shifted in the span of 30 seconds from fear into disbelief. "This account here," David pointed his finger steady against the paper. "Registered 3 days after the merger announcement. The routing number traces back to an entity registered under your name, Mr. Coleman, not the company's." "That's not..." Richard's champagne glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the floor. "That's not what it looks like. That's a mistake, a clerical error." "I would never..." "Section 9, David said, cutting through the stammering, "includes the original bank confirmation time-stamped with your digital signature attached." Richard's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Hayes closed the folder slowly. He looked up, not at Richard, but at David, studying him the way a man studies something he has badly misjudged. "Who are you?" Hayes asked. "David Foster." He did not blink. "I clean this building at night. I also happen to hold a law degree, sir, and 11 years of experience in forensic accounting before circumstances I won't burden you with led me here." The room absorbed this in silence. Somewhere behind David, Dennis Park shifted his weight, arms no longer crossed, watching Richard now with an expression closer to contempt than duty. Richard backed toward the window, his face drained of color, his earlier swagger collapsed into something smaller, uglier, cornered. "You can't prove any of this," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "You can't—" "The Securities and Exchange Commission received a complete copy of this documentation 4 days ago," David said. "I imagine you'll be hearing from them shortly." William Hayes set the folder down with the care of a man handling something radioactive. He looked at Richard for a long moment, the calculation behind his eyes visible even to those who did not know him well. "Richard," Hayes said quietly, "sit down." It was not a request. The balance of power in the room had shifted so completely, so suddenly, that no one moved to correct it. David Foster stood at the head of the table now, not by force, not by threat, but by the simple, devastating weight of truth laid bare on mahogany wood. Richard Coleman, once untouchable, sank into his chair like a man watching his own execution begin. William Hayes slammed both palms against the table. "Explain this to me." His voice carried the particular calm of a man who had not yet decided how violent his anger would become. "Now!" Richard Coleman stood near the window, his back to the glass, sweat beading along his hairline despite the room's cool air. "William, this is—" He stopped, started again. "This is a setup. That man fabricated all of it. He fabricated bank confirmations with your digital signature. He's a janitor with a grudge." Richard's voice climbed thin and cracking. "He's been circling me for weeks, watching me, waiting for a chance to destroy everything I've built. This is revenge, nothing more." David stood by the door, silent, letting the accusation hang in the air without dignifying it. "Revenge for what exactly?" Hayes turned toward him now, his eyes sharp, assessing. "What did you do to this man, Richard?" Silence answered first. "Nothing worth mentioning." Richard's jaw tightened. "Standard workplace discipline. He was insubordinate. I corrected it." David held up his phone screen, angled toward the table. A confirmation notice glowed on the display, time-stamped official, stamped with the seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. "This is the receipt for the documentation I submitted 4 days ago, Mr. Hayes. You're welcome to verify it directly with the investigator listed." Hayes took the phone. He studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before setting it down beside the folder David had brought. "William." Richard's voice dropped pleading now, the polish gone entirely from his tone. "You know me. We've worked together for 6 years. You can't possibly believe this rat over Section 14.2. Hayes did not look up. "You wrote that clause yourself, Richard, after the Kessler scandal. You stood in this very room and told the board it would protect us from exactly this kind of exposure." Richard's mouth opened, but no defense came. "Asset seizure, immediate termination without severance, full forfeiture of unvested equity." Hayes closed the folder with a soft final sound. "You built the mechanism that's about to destroy you. This is insane." Richard's hands shook now visibly uncontrollably. "You're going to take his word over mine, over 6 years of loyalty, of profit, of everything I've delivered to this company? I am taking the word of federal bank records." Hayes reached for the phone on the table and without hesitation dialed a number from memory. "Legal. I need you in the boardroom immediately. Bring the termination documents for executive misconduct under Section 14. Richard's face went white. "You can't do this." His voice cracked entirely now, all pretense of composure gone. "I have contacts, lawyers, people who owe me favors across this entire industry." "I'm sure you do." Hayes set the phone down. "None of them will matter once the SEC finishes cross-referencing those account numbers." Richard turned toward David, something desperate flaring behind his eyes. You did this. You think you've won something, you're nothing. You'll always be nothing. A janitor playing dress-up with numbers he doesn't understand. I understand them well enough, David said quietly, to know exactly how many years a judge typically hands down for wire fraud at this scale. Richard lunged half a step forward before catching himself, some last flicker of self-preservation stopping him from making things worse. His chest heaved, his hands curled into fists at his sides, useless now, powerless against the paper closing around him. Hayes activated the intercom on the table. Security, I need Dennis Park in the boardroom. William, please. Richard's voice broke entirely, the arrogance collapsing into something smaller, uglier, more desperate. Give me a chance to explain, to fix this. I can make the accounts right. I can. Section 14.2 is not a negotiation. Hayes's voice remained flat final. Effective immediately, you are terminated for cause. Your equity is forfeited. Your accounts, personal and corporate, will be frozen pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The door opened. Dennis Park stepped inside, his expression carefully neutral, though David caught the faint satisfaction beneath it. Escort Mr. Coleman to his office, Hayes said. He is permitted to collect personal items only. Nothing electronic, nothing financial. Richard did not move at first. He stood frozen at the center of the room that had until 20 minutes ago belonged entirely to him, his empire dissolving in real time under the weight of his own signature. His eyes dropped to his shoes, Italian leather hand-stitched, worth more than most people in this building earned in a month. They had carried him through boardrooms, through country clubs, through a life built on the assumption that consequences were things that happened to other lesser people. They could not carry him out of this. This isn't over, Richard said, though his voice had lost every ounce of conviction it once carried. It is, Hayes said. It ended the moment you signed that clause. Dennis stepped forward and placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, firm, unyielding. Richard flinched at the contact, then allowed himself to be guided toward the door, his shoulders sagging, his once immaculate posture crumbling into something smaller with every step. David watched him go, saying nothing, feeling nothing that resembled triumph, only the quiet, settled weight of a debt finally coming due. Somewhere beyond these walls, federal agents were already preparing the next phase of an investigation that would end within days in handcuffs and headlines. Richard Coleman had built his entire life on the certainty that people like David Foster did not matter enough to notice, let alone fear. He would have the rest of his life, whatever remained of it after prison, to understand exactly how wrong he had been. Sirens tore through the marble lobby before anyone understood what was happening. Federal agents moved through the front doors in tight formation vests marked SEC, and FBI radios crackling low static beneath the sound of a dozen boots against stone. Employees scattered toward the walls, phones raised, some recording, most simply staring. Richard Coleman stood frozen near the elevator bank, his face draining of color in real time. No! He backed away one step, then another. No, this isn't. He turned and ran. He made it 4 steps before Dennis Park's arm caught him across the chest, solid as a barrier, unmovable. Richard slammed into it and staggered back, gasping, his expensive shoes scraping against the polished floor. Let go of me. Richard's voice cracked into something raw, something no longer resembling authority. You work for me. Not anymore, Dennis said. A woman stepped through the doors, then gray coat pressed and precise, a badge held level at her waist. Patricia Wells did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room quieted around her the way rooms quiet around people who have already won. Richard Coleman. She stopped 3 feet from him, her eyes flat, professional, utterly unmoved by the panic contorting his face. You are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement of corporate assets in excess of $3 million. This is insane. Richard's eyes darted, searching the crowd for anyone who might intervene. William, tell them. Tell them this is a mistake. William Hayes said nothing. He stood near the boardroom entrance, arms folded, his expression carved from the same stone as the floor beneath him. Whatever loyalty he had once extended to Richard had evaporated the moment the folder crossed his desk. You'll also be charged with assault, Patricia continued, in connection with an incident 3 weeks ago involving a former employee. Richard's mouth opened, closed, opened again, but nothing came out. For the first time since David had met him, Richard Coleman had no words left, no clever deflection, no sneer to hide behind. David stood in the corner near the loading dock entrance, unnoticed by most of the room watching. He had not planned to be here for this exact moment, but something in him had known quietly for weeks that he would find a reason to stay close when it finally happened. You don't understand. Richard's voice dropped, pleading, now stripped of every ounce of the arrogance that had once filled this lobby like smoke. I built this. I built all of this. You stole most of it, Patricia said. Turn around. Dennis guided him without gentleness, one hand firm between his shoulder blades. The cuffs clicked shut around Richard's wrists, cold steel against skin that had never known real consequence until this moment. Richard's knees buckled slightly. He caught himself against the reception desk, his $10,000 watch scraping against the marble edge, and for a long moment he simply stared down at his own hands, bound now useless, no longer capable of shoving, kicking, or striking anyone beneath him. Wait! His head snapped up, eyes searching the crowd until they found David. Recognition flickered across his face, slow and terrible, the final piece falling into place. The janitor. The silent one. The man he had kicked, humiliated, searched in public, thrown to the floor without a second thought. You. The word came out as barely more than breath. It was you. David held his gaze and said nothing. You're nobody, Richard whispered, though the certainty had gone out of it entirely, replaced by something closer to disbelief. You clean floors. I did, David said. For a while. Dennis pulled Richard toward the doors. He did not resist further. His shoulders had collapsed inward, his posture folding into something smaller than the man who had once filled every room he entered. The agents flanked him on either side, and the lobby doors swung open to a waiting line of vehicles, lights flashing silent and red against the evening sky. Victoria Sterling stood near the elevators, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears sliding freely down her face now, though whether from grief or relief even, she could not have said. Patricia Wells approached David before leaving, extending a hand. Mr. Foster, the commission owes you a great deal of thanks. That documentation was some of the cleanest evidence we've received in years. Just doing what was right, ma'am. He shook her hand once, firm and brief. You could have come to us directly, you know. Skip the danger of gathering it yourself. David glanced toward the spot on the marble floor where months earlier he had knelt in dirty water while a man screamed insults over him. The stain was long gone now, scrubbed away by his own hands more times than he could count. Some things, he said, a man needs to finish himself. Patricia studied him a moment longer, then nodded once and turned to follow her team outside. David remained behind, alone in the lobby he had polished 1,000 times, watching the flashing lights fade into the distance through the glass doors. The chandelier above him glittered cold and indifferent as ever, but for the first time it did not feel like it belonged to someone else. He picked up a rag from the abandoned cleaning cart nearby, more from habit than necessity, and wiped a single smudge from the reception counter. Then he walked out into the evening air, unhurried, unbroken, carrying nothing but the quiet weight of a debt finally settled. Darkness has never been as terrifying. As those who claim to be elite, this is a work of fiction meant to expose the brutal hidden sides of power, prejudice, and exploitation. David's cold-blooded patience is what truly haunts me. Have you ever turned an enemy's contempt into a blade and driven it back into them? Subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on the most brutal, most satisfying revenge stories.